Coming up on Extraordinary Faith, we'll tour new churches in California and Wisconsin that are setting a trend by being built in a traditional style. We'll meet Duncan Stroik, one of the most prominent architects behind the resurgence of classic church designs. And we'll pay a visit to Dr. Dennis McNamara, a member of the faculty at Chicago's Mundelein Seminary, who has literally written the book on good church architecture. We're building on Catholic tradition on Extraordinary Faith. Hello, I'm Alex Began, welcoming you to Come on the Road with Extraordinary Faith, exploring the renewed interest in Catholic traditions. When you think about classic Catholic architecture, your mind likely turns to the grand Gothic and Romanesque churches that were built across North America during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Many of the churches built since the 1960s, however, are less distinguished, fitting into the office buildings, strip malls, and subdivisions that surround them. The tide is starting to turn, however. Classic church design is making a big comeback. We'll introduce you to some of the breakout beauties and the talented individuals who designed them. But first, we'll talk to a seminary professor who literally wrote the book on beautiful church design. Sacred architecture is both an academic field and a visual one. To help us understand both the theological and the visceral basis for good church design is Dr. Dennis McNamara, Assistant Director of the Liturgical Institute at Chicago's Mundelein Seminary. And that happens to be Cardinal George Mundelein on the wall behind us. Dennis, I first learned about you through your book, Heavenly City. Tell us about that book and what motivated you to write it.
Well, Heavenly City was really the first book to talk about the beautiful churches of Chicago. There had been a number of neighborhoods that were changing and churches that were being torn down, and somebody decided there needed to be a book about this to save these churches from the wrecking ball for the most part. And Chicago is a very significant architectural city, but Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies van der Rohe and other architects were so famous that people sort of forgot the churches. The churches of Chicago and any other city would be the reason people visit the city. But in Chicago, they're all in the back neighborhoods, and we thought the world needed to know about them.
What are some of the criteria for what constitutes a good church design?
Well, of course, a church has to do what a church needs to do. So you get the functional requirements settled right away, have all the parts that it needs to have. And that's often where most people stop. They say, well, if we have an altar and pews and a bride's room and bathrooms, then we're done. And maybe we'll throw a statue in the corner for some pious old people, But to really step back 3 steps and say, what's the essential nature of a church? And if a church is a sacrament of Christ, as all the tradition of the church tells us, because the Bible talks about the Christian assembly, the people joined to their head, Christ, being living stones in God's building. So that's the theology of the people, but then you take it outward and say, this building shows us where the people will be and what the people will be doing in their heavenly condition. So the church becomes a visual sacrament or a visual image of the wedding feast of the Lamb, which is the biblical language of God and humanity united, eternally celebrating the reuniting of humanity and God after the rupture of the fall. And so a church is radiant, glorified, centered on God, joyful, and elevated. Everything about it is elevated, just like the language of the Mass is elevated, just like the Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus is the sound of the angels singing in heaven. So the architecture will show you to the eye what the angels singing in heaven look like, and then we get to join our voices to that. And Vatican II makes this very clear. They say that the sacred art should be composed of signs and symbols of heavenly realities, and then you just have to ask the question, what are heavenly realities? And if you do that, you'll have a beautiful church.
These days, an increasing number of churches are choosing to add the extraordinary form to their schedules. How should that affect church design decisions?
Well, if a pastor and a parish building committee know they're going to be using the extraordinary form, then they have to say, what do we need to have the extraordinary form in our parish? Usually the major change would involve communion rails or altar rails, which is interesting because there's no church legislation about altar rails, and there never has been. Everybody did them for centuries without any church legislation, and they took them out without church legislation. So they can come back without any particular rule according to the permission of the local bishop. So that would be the most important thing to have in mind for the extraordinary form, I'd say.
So much starts at the parish level, where pastors and parishioners are involved in the key decision-making planning process. Those people really need a good understanding of liturgical principles. Do you have any recommendations on how people in those positions can improve their knowledge of liturgy and architectural standards?
Well, sure. The first thing to do is look at what the church herself asks. And one of the greatest places to look for the theology of church architecture is the rite of dedication of a church. It's the big book that the bishop uses when a church is dedicated. And you read the prayers, and they're very clear. They say, this building, which is an image of the Christian people assembled in heavenly glory. And it brings the Old Testament psalms about, oh, gates lift up your heads, let the King of glory enters. And suddenly you start to say, this isn't just a meeting house, as people often said a few decades ago, but this is the sacrament of the heavenly Jerusalem, the heavenly city of Jerusalem. Just as Christ entered the earthly Jerusalem through the gates of the walls, so the front door of a church is the great triumphal arch into the heavenly city. And you start reading those things, you say, oh wow, there's important theology embedded in the rite itself, which tells us about the nature of the building. And then there are all the instructions that the church gives about what a church is and how it ought to be done.
If you research church architects who work in the classic idiom, one name comes up over and over again, Duncan Stroik. We're here at one of Duncan's most prized creations, Our Lady of the Most Holy Trinity Chapel at Thomas Aquinas College in Santa Paula, California. So many churches in recent decades seem to have been built without too much regard to sacred art. Why is that beginning to change now?
I think there's a great hunger on the part of the faithful for beauty, and I think it grows out of the Catholic sense of sacramentality, that we believe that the material can express the immaterial. And so there's a great desire, and also the young bishops and priests who are calling for architects to rebuild the church literally and figuratively.
Is there something that speaks to the soul about a certain consistency in church design?
I think so. I think people are looking for geometric consistency, order, symmetry. Also in our churches we expect there to be transcendence, so there's a verticality. And traditionally there's also been more of a directionality, like a nave, a long nave. And that's something that we're coming back to, or relearning what that means.
There are a few principal categories of traditional church design, Gothic, Romanesque, etc. Could you help our viewers understand what those are and what they mean?
It's interesting that you say that, Alex, because Thomas Aquinas College is a great books program, and they wanted this church to reflect all the great categories of sacred architecture. But what we tried to integrate was really the early Christian aspects of the Romanesque in the vaulting, the Renaissance, and you could say the Baroque with the baldacchino. So the nave is the central part of the church, and it's where the people gather. And it comes from the word navis, which is Latin, like navy, for ship, because the church is like a ship, like the ark that protects us from the flood, that brings us through baptism. And the nave leads us towards the sanctuary, towards the altar. On this side, we have the aisles, and these are very generous because this is all about procession and pilgrimage, and it gives a spaciousness to the church. And the side aisles also, in this chapel, are used for special occasions when we can fill them up with extra seating. At the end of the aisle, you see this wonderful side shrine, which is an image of the baptism of Christ. And halfway down the aisle, we have a cross axis, which is the confessional. The transept, or the crossing of the church with its great dome, signifies the center of the cross. And below that is the sanctuary with the apse. And this is the focus of the church, with the marble floor, with the raised stairs, with the baldacchino, underneath of which is the altar. And you can see on top of the baldacchino 4 angels. And what might they be? They're all holding symbols of the Passion, of the Eucharist. We have a small rail, and you can see a raised pulpit for reading the scriptures and preaching. The sanctuary has this beautiful curved altar rail with 2 colors of marble, which are trying to connect visually that to the baldacchino. And the baldacchino is the 4 columns that define the holy place, the Holy of Holies in the church. and they're made out of bronze. And if you look at those above, you see the canopy of the baldacchino, which is the Holy Spirit, the dove there. So the dove is coming down upon the altar, upon the people, and then above that we have the angels who are leading us in worship, and then a very unique aspect of this baldacchino, which has a crucifix on the top. Then if we look at the altar itself, which is a pure white marble, and it has 3 panels symbolizing the Trinity, and remember this is Our Lady of the Most Holy Trinity Chapel. So here's really the raison d'etre of the church. Our Lady of the Most Holy Trinity Chapel, the altar of sacrifice. And it's fairly subtle, but because it's dedicated to the Trinity, we have 3 equal panels. Now this church was designed so that Mass could be celebrated in the Novus Ordo in English, in Latin, but also in the extraordinary form. And so you can see that a priest can stand on either side of the altar, which is really classic. If you look at the ancient basilicas in Rome, they're designed this way, with a freestanding altar, but with a great baldacchino, creating almost an exclamation point. This is the important spot. Then behind the altar, and in relation to it, is where the Blessed Sacrament goes after Mass, where we can have adoration, where this beautiful Blessed Sacrament tower, with Christ the Redeemer standing on top of it, is also a focus. So the altar and tabernacle are both a major focus of the church. So the exterior of the Chapel of Our Lady of the Most Holy Trinity is a Spanish-inspired design that partakes of the great classical tradition. So we have a grand triumphal arch that you enter between. And on the left is St. Augustine, and on the right is St. Thomas Aquinas, who are the 2 great teachers of this Great Books program, above which there's a great pediment with a window, and then the namesake of the church, Our Lady. Next to her is the 134-foot tower, which is dedicated to the Trinity. You can see why. It has 3 bells in 3 arches. And the desire was this great temple would be seen for miles around and inspire people like the great actor Anthony Hopkins to come here and to find peace and joy.
Since we filmed the previous segment, our crew decided to venture forth to another project with which Duncan Stroik has been affiliated, the Shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Though it's in a semi-rural setting, this is one of the most elaborate churches built in America in the past 40 years, with a busy liturgical life. We'll begin our visit with Father John Swing and his brother Bill Swing, whose family donated the natural acreage on which the church was built. Father Swing, we'll start with you. How did your family become involved in the project?
It was then Bishop Burke, now Cardinal Burke, who was looking for a place to build a shrine. And one day, by happenstance, met my mother, and they started to talk about the shrine, and my mother was so enthusiastic. We always wanted to do something with this beautiful place, something more than to have it developed for commercial use, but rather to dedicate it to God. And so it was after that initial meeting that things started to roll.
Bill, could you tell us why a traditional church design was selected?
It starts with my mother and dad. They were very much Catholic by all sense of the terms. Back pre-Vatican II, they were very faithful with the traditional church. And I think the way this shrine has come around really represents their deep faith in the traditional sense of the church.
Did either of you have any idea that the project would turn out to be as monumentally large as it is today?
Well, the first drawings, one of the questions that was asked is, will there be electricity up there? So that's how modest the plans were at the beginning of the project. Yes, so no, it was beyond our wildest dreams.
You'll notice a family resemblance between the Shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe and Duncan Stroik's other church, the chapel at Thomas Aquinas College in California. The main difference between these two churches is the immense amount of artwork here in La Crosse. With us to explain it is Sister Ancilla Matter, a member of the Sisters of St. Francis of the Martyr St. George and the Director of Communications here at the Shrine. Sister, what are we standing in front of here?
We are standing in front of a painting of Saint Therese, known as the Little Flower of the Holy Face. You'll notice there's the Shroud of the Holy Face there and the roses by which she is known. She is pictured with Saint Théophane Vénard, who was a martyr when he was ministering to the people of Vietnam.
The eye is naturally drawn upwards here. What can you tell us about the dome?
The dome is the exact color of Our Lady of Guadalupe's mantle when she appeared. The stars are actually the exact constellation that was in the sky when she appeared on December 12, 1531. And that constellation is also seen on her mantle in the image that, if you're familiar with Our Lady of Guadalupe, you're familiar with the image that appeared on St. Juan Diego's tilma. So the constellation of stars matches constellation you'll see here in the dome, which was in the sky in 1531 when she appeared.
What are the medallions that are surrounding the dome?
There are 4, they're called pendentives. The artist for those pendentives and a lot of the artwork that you'll see here at the shrine, he is Anthony Visco and he is out in Philadelphia. Pendentives are situated where architecturally you'll see, like, you'll have the circle of the dome meets like the squareness of the building. So it's kind of, he explained it to me, where you have the circle of eternity meets the squareness or the mundaneness of our earthly situation or so. So it's like heaven meets earth, and there's this space where there's just this, what he calls like a sacred space. So these pendentives are situated in that sacred space. And these 4, there are 4 doctors of the church: Saint Ambrose, Saint Ephrem, Saint John Damascene, and Cyril of Jerusalem. And these 4 doctors are known. They were chosen to be portrayed here by Cardinal Burke, who's the founder of the shrine. And he chose these 4 because of their writings on Our Lady as the Mother of God and as the Immaculate Conception.
Tell us about the baldacchino and the image of Our Lady behind the altar.
The baldacchino is modeled after the baldacchino at St. Mary Major Basilica in Rome. And the icon or mosaic of Our Lady of Guadalupe comes to us. It was put together piece by piece at the Vatican Art Studios, and then it was shipped over here and placed in that above the altar. And the way her disposition is, her looking down, it's as if she wants to draw our attention to the tabernacle where her Son is for us, always present for us. So she wants us to come to her Son, and that was her whole message. She is our mother. We could come to her, and her wish is that we all draw closer to her Son.
We understand that the Latin Mass is a part of your liturgical schedule here.
Yes, we have the traditional Latin Mass every Sunday morning at 9:30.
After visiting the chapel at Thomas Aquinas College, we decided to make the trek out to South Bend, Indiana, home of the University of Notre Dame, to visit Duncan Stroik's offices. This is ground zero for much of new church design in North America today. Duncan, first of all, how much of your practice is Catholic related?
You know, we think of what we do as Catholic architecture, and so 90%, and that includes churches, chapels, cathedrals, but also includes monastic buildings, Catholic college work, and parochial schools.
I suppose there's no reason why buildings other than churches proper can't have their own Catholic identity.
Yes, I think we should return to the great tradition of
the other institutions that Catholics built, monasteries, schools, universities, and hospitals. I mean, that's a great tradition, and our architecture expressed beauty, transcendence, and the faith.
Since we're here, can you show us some of the work you have in progress?
Sure, be happy to. This is a project for a new cathedral in the south, and on a beautiful hilly site, and with the local stone, 2 towers, a statue of the Redeemer on the dome, and then it has to accommodate many cars and people coming in different directions, this wonderful hill, and it has a couple of buildings that, arcades that lead you to the church. And then when you go inside, it's a vaulted space with an emphasis towards the altar, which has a great dome over the baldacchino, side chapels, and seating for up to 1,000 people. So one of the things that I also do, Alex, is edit a magazine called Sacred Architecture. We founded it about 15 years ago, just because there's nothing out there that promotes sacred architecture, and especially from a classical point of view. So it's been great fun. I find it inspiring, and it's one of the many hats that I wear.
It's not just the magazine you publish, you've also written a book.
I love reading and writing and scholarship and how that could be made public. Get it in the hands of bishops and pastors and building committees and inspire them. So yeah, this book is called, I named it The Church as a Building a Sacred Place, and it's really the result of 20 years working on this, many of my ideas, and put together in one place. One of the most exciting things that's been happening in the last quarter century is a movement for traditional urbanism, traditional towns, villages, and cities, and to make them walkable again. And in general, an architecture that's more human, more humane, and to emphasize community, something that we used to do very well in this country. And of course, when you design a village or a town properly, and this is happening all across the country, you need to think about the public buildings. Where do they go? And when we think of our villages and towns, you think of the courthouse, the library, the school, and the church. And so it's very exciting to see some new towns which are planning to have a green and a public building and a church near the center people can walk to. And I guess the church building is a sacred place, beauty, transcendence, and the eternal. I think the thing that I've been struck at ever since graduate school at Yale, someone once gave me advice. He said, "You're interested in beauty and you should pursue that." Now that was stunning in 1985, because in architecture school we never talked about beauty. It was verboten. We talked about other things, but never about beauty. And I realized, he's right, he's got something. And what I really feel strongly about, and I'm so happy to see across the country, is a return to beauty in our churches and in our other architecture as well. I came to Notre Dame about 25 years ago on the invitation of Thomas Gordon Smith, and he founded this new program of classical architecture, the first program of classical architecture in about 40 years. It was very hard at first, and people thought we were crazy. The students rebelled. The university didn't understand it. And I would say we've had an amazing success. We're not the majority view in architecture by any means, but it's really exciting to see our students, 40 to 60 students a year, going out in the world and designing traditional cities, designing classical buildings, designing beautiful houses, museums, you name it, and have an effect on the American culture and frankly in Europe and Canada as well. It's just an honor to be an architect who gets to teach and to focus on sacred architecture.
Can you identify any particular elements that create sacred space?
Yes, I think there are. All great sacred buildings have verticality, which emphasizes transcendence. They have directionality, starting at one point and leading towards something. They have solidity, stability. They're built out of fine materials that are going to last for centuries, and they're iconographical. They have imagery that we can relate to, we can understand. They tell a story through painting and sculpture. So those are the points, I think, that are crucial to sacred architecture, all sacred architecture, but especially Catholic sacred architecture, that we have been relearning in these last decades. And it's very exciting to see young architects and old architects rediscover these ideas. And the lay people, they've always known it.
Could you tell us something about the artwork at the Shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Crosse?
It's an amazing place because, as you know, there's a series of buildings, a series of outdoor chapels, and a series of artists. And one of the visions of Cardinal Burke was that it wouldn't just be one artist to do everything, but that it would be really a collaboration of many artists, some architects, and of course the Cardinal himself. It was very exciting to try to find talented painters to do altarpieces, sculptors to sculpt in marble and bronze from Italy, from Mexico City. And we had one great, really he's multifaceted, Tony Visco. He's both a painter and a sculptor who helped coordinate all of them and worked with them, and even worked with the stained glass people too, to make sure that things were done of a similar scale, similar aesthetic, but there's variety. So we wanted richness and variety. And so it was a great honor to work with lots of different artists in one building, and well, one building, one complex. And you know, our job as architects is to really provide the frame. We often show in our drawings ideas about what the altarpiece is going to look like or the sculpture, but really then we want to turn it over to really talented artists. They're going to do something much better than we could have ever conceived of. So we're designing the frame, we're designing the pedestal, we're proposing it. We propose it to the client. You need two statues on either side, and they decide it's Peter and Paul, or they decide it's Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine. It's very exciting to work with the artists. And I think that actually for the common man, let's say, that it's the artwork that really drives them. The architecture is more cerebral, it's more, you feel it. But the artwork is what people are really drawn to. They see faces, they see figures, they see a story being told. We all love that. And so the architecture really is just the environment for the art. It's to display the art, it's to show off the art. And why do we have art in Catholic churches? To help raise people up, to ennoble them, and to help them think heavenly thoughts.
On our next episode, we'll take you inside the world of the traditional Catholic artisan. What's old is new again as these skilled individuals work to restore historic churches to their original glory. We'll take you to the largest church restoration company in America, where everything from stained glass to statues is made. And we'll tour churches which have been upgraded in inspirational ways. Come back and see the classic look back in style on Extraordinary Faith. You can learn more about all the beautiful churches we visit on the episodes page of our website, extraordinaryfaith.tv. We welcome you to contact us there with questions and comments, and like us on Facebook so that you can keep up with all the breaking news about our programs. Thanks for spending a part of your day with us, and join us often as we explore the wonders of Catholic tradition here on Extraordinary Faith.